Flint. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy here, and I serve as the director of the Center for Philosophy of Religion. And I'd like to welcome you to this first ever Plantinga Fellow Lectureship. The Center for Philosophy of Religion has existed here at Notre Dame for well over a quarter of a century now. And I think it's safe to say that at the heart of the center's activities is the program of fellowships that we offer. Each year we have roughly half a dozen scholars from around the world in residence at Notre Dame working on projects in philosophy of religion or philosophical theology or Christian or theistic philosophy. As tends to happen with research fellowships, their activity goes on pretty much in isolation from what happens at the rest of the university. And we at the center thought that this probably wasn't an ideal situation. It would be nice to expose their work and their talents to a wider audience. And that's why we had the idea for this lectureship. The idea, again, is to have our most senior fellow offer a talk directed not simply at other philosophers, but at a general philosophical audience. The current holder of our most senior fellowship, which was recently renamed the Plantinga Fellowship, is Professor Brian Leftow, and he very graciously agreed to offer this talk, and so that's why we're here today. Brian is, I think, undeniably one of the major figures working today in a number of different fields in philosophy, in medieval philosophy, philosophy of religion, metaphysics, to name only a few. Brian was born in Brooklyn, New York, received his graduate degrees at Yale University, was for many years a professor at Fordham University in New York, and beginning, I guess, next month, will be actively assuming his new position as, and I think I remember the title, the Noluth Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion at Oriel College at Oxford University, succeeding Richard Swinburne in that position. During his time here, Brian's been working on no fewer than 3 book projects. If I remember, there was one on Aquinas and metaphysics, one on God and modality, and one on divine simplicity, I believe. His first book, though, called Time and Eternity, was an attempt to have contemporary philosophers of religion take more seriously the idea of divine eternity. And he returns to us today with a lecture on basically that same topic of God and timelessness. The title of his paper is Scripture, God, and Time. Let me just mention that after Brian's talk, we will have ample time for questions and discussion, and we will also have refreshments outside the auditorium after the talk, so make sure that you plan to stay for those as well. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Professor Brian Leftow.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is the Plantinga Fellow Lectureship, and so in some sense is named for Alvin Plantinga, who is, for now 35 years and counting, the dominant figure, or one of the dominant figures in philosophy of religion. It's a great honor and pleasure to be the first to give a lecture named for him in this series. That, of course, raised the question exactly what should I talk on. If you've seen philosophers give tribute to other philosophers, you know how this tends to go. The fellow starts out by saying something nice about the honoree, then spends the next 40 minutes tearing down everything he ever wrote, and ends up by saying, and so's your mother. I decided not to do that out of respect for the fact that he could kick my butt. And the second alternative, of course, is to speak on one of the subjects on which I agree with Al, but that, of course, would be sycophantic, and Oxford sucks up to no one. Thus it is that the first Alvin Plantinga Fellowship lecture is on a subject on which, as far as I know, Al has no opinion whatsoever. And here goes. Augustine, Aquinas, and almost all Christian thinkers between them held that God's life is not in time. This is a hard claim to get your mind around, but here's one way to start to understand it. My speaking now has a past. I was quiet before I started speaking. It also has a future. I will keep on speaking for a while, hopefully not too long, and then there will be cookies. Whatever happens in time either has a past or has a future, or has parts with a past or a future. If God's life is not in time, it has no past, no future, and no parts with either. Nothing is ever over for a timeless God. If it was over, it would lie in his past, and so he'd have a past. Nothing has not yet started for a timeless God. If it had not yet started, it would lie in his future, and so he'd have a future. Rather, for a timeless God, everything is happening. Everything in his own life and everything in everything else's history. Because of this, a timeless God does not change. If you change, first something in your life isn't happening, and then it is. Before I spoke, you weren't thrilled. Now you are. So your thrill level has changed. Most recent thinkers prefer to say that God is in time and changes. Some say that if God is timeless and changeless, he is remote from and unaffected by our doings, impassive rather than loving, and so not much like the Old Testament's depiction of a God sometimes jealous, sometimes angry, always loving. I think this is way false, but I won't press this point here. Those who offer this falsehood tend to call the timeless, changeless picture of God Greek, and the other Hebrew, and they malign the Greek picture as importing foreign philosophical ideas that pull us away from an authentically biblical idea of God. The thought, it seems, is supposed to be that Scripture says nothing that really supports the claim that God is timeless. Thus Nelson Pike, I quote, "The doctrine of God's timelessness was introduced into Christian theology because Platonic thought was stylish at the time." Thus too Nicholas Wolterstorff. "The most important factor accounting for the tradition of a timeless God within Christian theology was the influence of the classical Greek philosophers on the early theologians. But the patterns of classical Greek thought are incompatible with the pattern of biblical thought. The church fathers, we're told, were unduly swayed by the power and prestige of Greek philosophy, and it's supposed to be our job to recover from their historic lapse." This picture of the history of theology is a caricature. I want to take a more careful look at one part of the caricature, its claim about Scripture. And I'm going to focus on just the claim that God is timeless. I'd be the first to admit that the word timeless does not occur in Scripture. But it's way too simple to say that Scripture provides no support for divine timelessness, or straightforwardly teaches that God is in time. The most important things in Scripture, when considering God's relation to time, are surely the texts that address this directly. I'll now try to show that the true state of affairs is this. Scripture's explicit statements about God's relation to time set a condition philosophical views of God's relation to time must meet. More than one philosophical view can meet this condition. Some meet it better than others. One popular version of the claim that God is in time does not meet this Scripture condition. One historically popular view of the claim that God is not in time does meet it. I'll suggest that this version might meet the Scripture condition better than any version of temporalism does, though this part of what I have to say can't go beyond a suggestion in the time I have here. But if a version of the claim that God is timeless at least meets the Scripture condition, then whether or not it best meets that condition, Scripture can be said to provide support for the claim that God is not in time, and I'll talk a bit about the sense in which that's so later on. If Scripture does provide support for this, I think writers like Pike and Wolterstorff would do well to withdraw their claims that the Church Fathers just aped then current trends or did not take Scripture seriously enough. Okay, so let's get into Scripture. Some Old Testament authors express part of God's relation to time by saying that number 1 on your handout, God exists, quote, from everlasting to everlasting. I'm going to assume that this is an adequate translation and ask what it asserts. To some, 1 asserts that, number 2 on your handout, God exists, has existed through all past time, and will exist through all future time. But if 1 asserted just 2, 1 would be true even if there has been only a finite amount of past time, or will be just a finite amount of future time, say 5 minutes of each, so long as God existed and will exist through all of it. And this does not seem so. Intuitively, a life with a 5-minute past is not from everlasting, and one with a 5-minute future is not to everlasting. And things don't change if we suppose that the finite past and future measure 5 billion years and not 5 minutes. 5 billion years is not an everlasting time. It's just a very long but finite one. Consider the claim that everlasting time is now over. That sounds like a joke. Maybe you hear it in the voice of James Earl Jones. It would sound a little more impressive. Not something that could ever literally be true. Literally everlasting future time is never over. It always goes onward. There's always more of it to last. And something parallel is true in a pastward direction. So 1 does not assert 2, or not just 2. For if time were finite in extent, 2 would be true, but 1 would be false. But if 1 and 2 assert the same thing, 2 can't be true unless 1 is true. My argument makes 2 assumptions which strike me as reasonable. One is that the biblical authors meant to assert something definite by 1, even if they couldn't fully articulate it, that it wasn't just emotive poetry. They saw something, even if they couldn't say clearly what it was that they saw. The other assumption is that I can articulate what they saw well enough to show that it isn't 2. Why believe the latter? Well, the biblical authors wrote as they did out of a rough, intuitive picture of God and the world. This picture placed general constraints on their speech dispositions, of which they probably were not wholly aware. And as this is so, there are such things as answers they would probably have given to theological questions they were never asked. The better we understand what they said, the better the hypotheses we can make about what their speech dispositions were, and so about what they would have said in certain situations they did not envision. With their help, we can hope to see what they did and perhaps say it more clearly.